Hi colleagues, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you about assessment, and I wanted to talk to you about the difference between the data that we collect and the process of collecting data. So it's really important that we recognize as educators the importance of the process of collecting data so that we're not just looking at the outcomes. And so we know that oftentimes the data results are often displayed in schools, displayed in data rooms, and the scores are there. There's often graphs and charts of how students are doing, and it's sort of a summative perspective on the work of students. And there's so much more to assessment than just the data results, and there's so much more to the story behind each individual student. And so Tammy Mulligan and Claire Landrigan, in their text, Assessment in Perspective, remind us of knowing the story of a reader, knowing the story of the literacy events that happen as we lead up to the results. And so there is so much that we don't know about a student. For example, if we take a minute and sort of look at the fluency results from this particular student. So we can see in this graph and chart that this student is making progress over time to sort of increase their fluency. And so fluency is one aspect of literacy development. And yes, it's important. It impacts comprehension. If students aren't reading fluently, then they certainly are impacted in their development. But oftentimes, if we just look at one aspect of a reader, we know that that's not the full picture or the actual story of the reader. So it's important that we think about and share information, especially when we're thinking about data and data walls and displays, that there's an opportunity to really talk about what was the process for noticing the results, not just the summative charts, but what were we really observing about the students? So what did their comprehension look like as their fluency increased? So was the student impacted by their fluency increasing, or do they think the idea of reading is really about reading words faster, and practicing a passage again and again in some particular programs sometimes gets kids to read faster, but it doesn't essentially impact the one thing, comprehension, that's so critically important for students. So what are we noticing about them as that data is increasing? What do our anecdotal notes tell us? So what are we writing down as we're really listening to students and we're really taking the time and thinking about what is the student telling us about how this work is impacting them, and as we create goals for them and we really create that work, and the timing of that work is so important. So when does a student need something? And essentially, how does the data itself impact our instruction? And so all of our data points are conferring our formal assessments or our benchmark assessments that we look at students over time. And our standardized assessments, where students are compared to peers their age or at their grade level, so that we can tell collectively how students are doing, impacted by our instruction. But really, essentially, what did that instruction look like, and is it working or is it not working? So one resource that you have as part of this course is the Jennifer Saravallo text. And so I want to just take a minute and sort of look at some of the lessons and how your data might impact a student. So summatively, we have some results that your principal or someone may be looking at, but what is the story of the reader leading up to that point, and what has impacted this data, and are we happy with the amount of progress the student is making, or is there something else we need to do to accelerate that process? So it's critical that we talk about the instructional pathway of the student and the story of the learning, and not just look at the summary of results. So we certainly want them to make that leap in progress, but what actually led to the student making that progress is important. And it's important for all educators to hear that progress and to hear that story, so that essentially instruction for some of our most neediest students is often different in different places. And so if something is really impacting the student and we have data to show that, what is that assessment story? So was the student impacted by a lesson in Jennifer Saravello's text where they were provided with a post-it reminding them to talk like the character? Is that the conversation that the student was having in their head, right? So were they reminding themselves, oh, I have to really talk like the character here? Or were they really paying attention to the conventions of the text and talking like the character? And were we picking appropriate text, right? So here's Pigeon, and Pigeon certainly talks loud or yells or gets excited. And so were we picking text that really impacted the student? And is that why they're making progress in their fluency development? The student could have been impacted by practicing story language. And so using story language, lesson 1.10 is really a powerful lesson that you can support students with. And so Once Upon a Time, That Night, Happily Ever After, those are some examples that they have there, but some other language structures, the way a book talks, are even more powerful for our young learners. So things like when the character said something, said Tammy, said Joe, books typically talk different than they do, and so how can we support them with some type of stems or story language that they'll be practicing? And how can we support them in using that story language? Is that what impacted their fluency? So as you think through the assessment process, remember that as a teacher, you are the expert. And you're the expert at designing the curriculum and really thinking about the impact of the data and how can you be as intentional and as powerful as possible to be able to set some goals for students. How do you have conversations with them with the assessment process? So many times we'll take a running record with students, or we'll give a benchmark assessment with students, and then that piece of data really is for us to be able to set goals. But I think it's important to have some of those conversations with students so that they can identify with what is the actual work look like. So in the little mini anchor charts in the text, right, they are what we hand to students and say, this is the work that you're going to be doing. This is what you need to be able to do. Right? So when we leave them with an artifact or they talk through their goals, they have a reference and they know what types of errors they're making or what they really need to work on, so they can assess and say, hey, how's it really going? So when you're conferring with them and you're collecting notes and collecting that anecdotal information that impacts how the instruction is impacting the student, they have something to look at. So when you sit down with them and say, so how's it going? I know you're working on fluency, and so tell me about your goal. And how can they talk about that? And how can they tell you how they're doing? And then essentially, even when it's a very short text, students should be modeling for you after you've modeled and taught for them as they're practicing. This is how I'm practicing this goal, right? So whatever the goal may be, they're modeling it for you and showing it to you. So for example, if you have a very short text, even some of our lowest level readers, they should be working towards fluency or balancing some of their skills, even when they're in the stage where they're just reading the pictures or sort of memorizing the text, right? Sometimes we know that they don't really have that visual information to take on text, but we know that they're actually thinking about working as a reader, trying to put all of those pieces together, and they're practicing. So we accept those approximations. So for example, even if we gave them the shortest text, such as this text, hold on. Okay, I have the text. So even with a simple text like going for a ride, right? This is a level 3 text from Pioneer Valley, written by Michelle Dufresne. And if you haven't accessed Pioneer Valley's online digital site, they have some excellent resources for students to be able to read even the earliest emergent text. And so as we're working with students, we want to be sure that as we get so excited that they're actually engaging and learning some of their sight words, and we're willing to accept so much because they're working so hard as readers, we have to be careful that we just don't take it as they're saying the words and really push them to be fluent and connect with the text. So many students, after they've read this and practiced it 1 or 2 times, will still continue to read and point. Look at my car. I am driving my car. So after the initial read where they've processed the text, they understand the pattern of the text, they're familiar with the sight words and how the structure of the text works, we need to push them on the second reread or the third reread, or as they're rereading, oh, you've read this book before, so let's try to put those words together. Can you make it sound like this? Look at my car. You try it, right? So that essentially, as our students begin to develop and correspond with the one-to-one matching, and they've internalized that, at some point we need to push them to put those words together. So it might not completely be scooped and look like this to the punctuation, but certainly once they've memorized the text, it can be, look at my car, because at some point they're not really looking, they know how the text works, and so that's the point where we can push them to be more automatic with saying the text and being able to monitor, but also learning to put their words together as readers. So use your assessment, use what you notice about students, and then push those instructional goals with students and have them really self-assess. How's it going? What's happening for you as a reader? And even our youngest readers, kindergartners, first graders, they can certainly engage in this work. And by second grade, they're familiar with this type of format. So as you engage in your assessment process, really think about all those steps in the process and not just the outcome or the summary of the data.